human tragedy in many ways, with the migrant laborers with no public transport available, walking back to their modes. Now, so obviously economy has been in a pretty bad shape, and the expected contraction in the economy for the year, as given by the advance estimate of GDP last month by the Central Statistical Organization, is 7.7%. Now, it's not the contraction on account of pandemic is one thing, but the economy in general has been slowing down. In fact, the growth rate in the economy had slowed down from 8% in the last quarter of 2017-18. Yeah, 2017-18. It has been gradually slowing down, and actually in the last quarter of last year, that means 2019-20, the growth rate was just 3.1%, which is possibly one of the lowest that was seen in recent times. The investments have been declining. In fact, in 2017-18, investment rate was somewhere about 32%. It has declined to somewhere 28-29%. Now, there have been several reasons for this. One is what Arvind Subramanian, when he was the chief economic advisor, called the twin balance sheet crisis, where the balance sheets of the commercial banks have been completely overtaken, completely sort of affected by the non-performing assets. And the balance sheets of the corporates had not been doing well. In fact, corporates have not been borrowing, and then the bankers are not lending. And the financial stability report of the Reserve Bank of India basically said that after the pandemic, particularly the non-performing assets of the scheduled commercial banks is supposed to decline from 13.5% to 14.8% by September of 22, and the decline, the sharp decline in the public sector banks, the non-performing assets, is from 16.6% to 17.6%. That means that by September 22, almost 17.6% of the loans that they have given are likely to go sour. They are not likely to return. That's the sort of a situation that we have been in, and particularly because of the pandemic, the various regulatory forbearances that have been given, a moratorium and restructuring and all sort of things that have been given, they are likely to really affect the businesses very badly. There can be a spate of bankruptcies as we go along, and there may be a lot more of non-performing assets accumulating. What my good friend Urjit Patel says, kicking the can down the road through various these regulatory performances, or extending and pretending, saying that sort of that there is no problem, and if is not going to help matters. Now, bank credits have been slowing down. It's in this environment, obviously, the budget was presented, and obviously, there is a lot of rhetoric always whenever the budget is presented. I'll not go into this thing saying that, oh, the budget rests on 6 pillars: health and well-being, physical and social infrastructure. One of the things, before I go into some discussion on the economic survey, I want to say that somehow or other, the whole country wakes up to the central union budget, not realizing the fact that the actual expenditure incurred at the central government level is 30%. 70% of the expenditure is actually, implemented at the state level. Obviously, states get something like, sort of 20% through centrally sponsored schemes, which is a discretionary grant given by the government. And then there is generally the tax devolution and grants, which is given through a constitutional mechanism. But in terms of spending, almost 85% of the spending on healthcare is implemented at the state level. Almost 75 to 80% of the education expenditure is incurred at the state level. But then there is a lot of euphoria when, and then even when the state centers say that, oh, we increased the expenditure on health by so many percentages, actually it doesn't, in terms of the aggregate, the impact is not very large. Now let me very briefly come to the economic survey. The economic survey actually makes an impassioned plea for increased government expenditure. It says that, sort of government should spend more when it's in the lower part of the economic cycle. You need to really have a counter-cyclical policy, which basically means when the economy is slowing down, the government expenditure should increase. And when the economy is booming, then obviously the government should contract its expenditure. So it says that the counter-cyclical fiscal policy is important. Of course, everybody agrees with that. And so it says that debt sustainability should not be a concern, because this is the time when you should not bother about what happens to the debt sustainability, because there is an equation called the Domer equation, which basically says that if your primary deficit is zero, that means deficit excluding, deficit of the government excluding the interest payments. If the primary deficit is zero, then if the growth rate of the economy is faster than the effective interest rate the government pays, then the debt will decline, because debt to GDP ratio will decline. This is a simple arithmetic, so we don't really have to go into this. But so it says that even the primary deficit you should not bother about now. You should simply go about spending money, and because your growth rate is higher than the effective interest rate the government pays. You see, what is forgotten in this is that, if you do the financial repression and keep the interest rate low by pumping in liquidity, if the Reserve Bank does that, now obviously the interest rate is not going to go up, because the Reserve Bank is always there to pump in liquidity so that the yield stays low. And that has its own distortions that it creates. But in any case, this is the time when obviously the spending has to be done. But in other words, what I'm trying to say, that it's not as simple as the chief economic advisor's economic survey says. But nevertheless, he says that the debt sustainability should not be a concern now. And he says growth leads to debt sustainability, not the other way around. And then borrowing used for investment purposes has a high, what he calls the fiscal multiplier. That means borrowing, used for making investment in infrastructure actually helps in creating a multiplier effect for the private sector. So there is a lot of private sector activity that happens if the infrastructure is better. So, and therefore it should be done. And he goes on to say that the credit rating agencies have been unfair to India and generally to emerging markets. And so you should not bother about what the credit rating agencies do, and simply go about spending money. And growth is the most effective antidote for poverty. And you should not really bother about, sort of spending. You should really focus on the growth. Well, this is, we can take it this way. Obviously, he is making an impassioned plea for, sort of spending more. I am, but the fact of the matter is, it's not just the interest rate differences. One has to look at what is happening to the primary deficit as well. Obviously, spending more on infrastructure is helpful, but at the same time, we should also see that on the revenue expenditures, on current expenditure, spending should be minimized. Now, let me come to the budget. As I mentioned, the finance minister said that she is placing the budget on 6 pillars, which is health and well-being, physical and social infrastructure, inclusive development, reinvigorating human capital, innovation and research and development, and then she said minimum government and maximum governance. I see this more as a sort of a rhetoric. I think every budget has to have rhetoric. Well, there are some discussions that go on, but let me go into what the budget has delivered. As I said, whenever we look at the budget, we need to look at 3 important things. From the point of view of a common man, what happens to the taxes, what happens to his sort of disposable savings, etc., etc. But obviously, nobody was expecting any sort of concessions this time. In fact, people were expecting additional taxes in terms of cesses and surcharges or in earmarked levies, as they say, for spending on defense and healthcare. But well, that has not happened, except that there is an additional 1% cess for to strengthening the agricultural infrastructure. Of course, there are some questions on that, particularly from the perspective of the states, because the money raised through cess doesn't become a part of the divisible pool with the states. I will come to that later. Now, we were all expecting, we were all, basically trying to see what has happened during the course of the year in terms of revenue collections, because even before the ink was dry, the last year's budget had become irrelevant. It had become irrelevant for 2 reasons. One is, as the Controller General of Accounts finalized the account, he found out that the budget had a much, sort of overestimated the revised estimates for the previous year. That's in 2018-19. Revised estimates were severely overestimated, and as a result, the budget estimates which were built on the base of the revised estimates were obviously unrealistic. In fact, the budget had estimated for 2018-19 the fiscal deficit of 3.8%, but the actual numbers compiled by the Controller General of Accounts said that the fiscal deficit was 4.6%. So, but then that was only the beginning. Now, when finally the pandemic struck, the entire estimates of revenue and expenditure for the year became completely unrealistic. Now, as you see that there has been a sharp decline in the revenue. As compared to 2018-19, the estimates of revenue show a contraction of 7.6%. And as compared to the budget estimates of the year, that is 2020-21, as compared to the budget estimates, the revised estimates show a lower figure of 23%. The taxes were lower by somewhere about 17.8%, and the non-tax revenues were lower by almost 45%, because dividends from various public enterprises, various other, including the dividends from the Reserve Bank of India, were, turned out to be lower. Although they tried to squeeze more from the Reserve Bank of India. Now, on the other hand, Expenditure figure shows an increase of 13.4% from the previous year. And as compared to the budget estimates, expenditure figures are higher by 28.4%. Revenue estimates are higher by 28%, and capital expenditures are higher by almost 31%. Now, if one looks at it, all these during the course of the year, the stimulus that was given was mainly through the Reserve Bank's moratorium, lowering of the interest rates, restructuring, and the like. And for the budget, not much was given. In fact, the fiscal stimulus coming from the budget was less than was just about 1% of GDP, or just a little over 2 lakh crores. But then how did it happen that expenditures have suddenly sort of increased? This is because I think during the course of the year, when the government saw that the economy was contracting by leaps and bounds by almost 24% in the first quarter, then it decided to start on a spending spree. In fact, from October onwards, the monthly figures show a sharp increase in both revenue and capital expenditure, that to help to revive the economy. And that's one, and of course, the thing continues because the revised estimates are all the way up to end of March this year. And so increase of 28% as compared to the budget estimate is mainly up in the second half of the year, which basically implies that the growth of GDP that was estimated earlier could turn out to be, in fact, the actual growth could turn out to be better, because in the previous quarter, in the first half of the year, the sector called the public administration and defense actually had a growth rate had a growth rate which was negative 11%, which means that that is likely to turn positive. And then obviously when the government expenditure increases, in a situation where the demand is very low in the economy, it also helps to increases sort of helps to increase the lift the demand up. So there was an allegation that much of the lifting of the problem was done by the Reserve Bank of India, but now it looks that the government has also been doing this, which basically implies, which is, I'm not objecting to that particular thing, but I think it was necessary. But what has happened as a result is that overall fiscal deficit in the country is estimated for the year at 9.5%. That means 2020-21. In other words, 9.5% of the total expenditure of the government of India was actually met from borrowed funds. Now, the government has tried to, become a little more transparent, because what used to happen earlier was that, for food subsidy, actually what the food subsidy is, Food Corporation of India purchases food grains, procures food grains from the farmers, and obviously it pays the minimum support price, procures the food grains. There is a transportation cost. There is a cost which is incurred in maintenance of the stocks, and then obviously it is sold through the public distribution system and at a very low price. And the difference between this, the cost, total cost, and the money that is realized is the volume of subsidy. And government in the last few years, what has been doing is it has not been paying it from the budget. It's been asking the Food Corporation of India to borrow money from what is called the National Small Saving Fund. Now, this National Small Saving Fund is, you and me put the money in the post office saving bank, post office bank on the NSS and post office savings. And this is put in the National Small Saving Fund. And the fund has a capital there. And so the Food Corporation borrows this money from the fund at a fairly high rate of interest, and Government of India gives the guarantee and says that it will repay at some point of time. So it's basically trying to to, instead of paying for the budget and showing, in order to show a lower fiscal deficit, they have been doing this obfuscation. Now what has happened is that, we have been saying that, see, please come clean, let us be transparent, let the people know. But anyway, the finance minister has decided to come clean. So for this year, she has made a slightly lower provision, and for next year, she said that there will not be any borrowing from the National Small Saving Fund. So if you add that back into this year's fiscal deficit, it works out to 10.1%, not 9.5%. And the primary deficit, which is a crucial this thing for debt dynamics, without with this additional off-budget borrowing, it works to somewhere close to 6%. Otherwise, it is about 5.5%, which basically means that it's not enough to have. It basically means that the debt is likely to grow this year. It is already almost close to 90%, and this 9.5%, so fiscal deficit estimated is actually much higher than what the new Finance Commission also has estimated. Finance Commission estimates that the fiscal deficit would be somewhere about 7.4%. Incidentally, Finance Commission is the constitutional commission, which is basically appointed every 5 years by the President of India, which makes a recommendation on the amount of money to be transferred, the taxes to be transferred to the states, and the grants to be given to the states. And there's a 15th Finance Commission has submitted the recommendation that has, that its recommendation will be effective from April 1st onwards. And that has also given a adjustment path, how to adjust the fiscal debt and deficits as we go along. Anyway, now what are the macro implications of this budget? Now, as I said, this year obviously we needed the government to spend more to lift the economy from the situation that we are in. And obviously, nobody is going to complain about either the deficits or the debt, because economic revival is more important. Now again, if you really look at it, so budget tells you what has happened in the current year, but it also tells you what it intends to do in the next year. That means 2021-22. If you look at it, next year's expenditure increase is not very large. No, in fact, the increase as compared to the revised estimates of this year is just about just about 1%. That's all. As a percentage of GDP, it actually is lower from 17.6 to 15.5%. Or 17.7% to 15.6%. In other words, there is not much of a public expenditure spending, that has been. Actually, revenue expenditure is lower next year by 2.7%, but the capital expenditure is higher by somewhere about 26%. So, which basically implies that the government intends to contain. Now, how are they going to finance it? Number one, they have, they have assumed that the nominal growth, not the real growth, nominal growth next year will be somewhere about 14%. The advanced estimate said that it will be 14.5%. So in that sense, they are a little more conservative. Nominal growth of the economy will be, of the GDP will be 14.4%, which basically implies that the tax revenues will rise by about 15% next year. And in the current year, they had initially budgeted for disinvestment, that means selling of public sector enterprises equity of the order of somewhere about 2.1 lakh crore. And the actual realization so far is just about 15,000 crore. But then they think that, this month and the next month, they will be able to gather another 15,000 crore. So actually, the total is, as against the budget estimate of 2.1 lakh crore, they are just getting 32,000 crore. So next year they have budgeted for 1.75 lakh crore, and possibly they will maybe able to get it, because there are a number of things which, this year they did not do it because the markets were low and the situation was not very congenial for the selling of the public enterprises. But possibly stock markets are doing much better this year now, and possibly they may be able to do it. And therefore they have talked about, selling of, privatizing many of the enterprises and selling of public sector equity and various other things. So higher tax revenue because of the economic recovery, as well as and higher disinvestment proceeds are the sort of helps it. And even with that, you will have a situation where your fiscal deficit will be somewhere, will be more than 6.5, 6 point, will be somewhere about 6.8% of GDP, which is fairly high, and the primary deficit will be 3.5%. So as I mentioned, next year's increase in expenditure is not very large. So they hope that the private sector will start doing things. Disinvestment will keep, will help to keep the deficit in, to some extent. But this even 6.8% that I'm talking about, as compared to the earlier figures, as I said, there was off-budget liabilities. There is no off-budget liability this year, so which is high, but at the same time, there's something which we cannot avoid. What is important is the increase planned in capital expenditure, and I hope they will be able to contain the revenue expenditure and increase the capital expenditure. There is a very significant talk that health expenditure has increased. As I mentioned, much of the health expenditure has to come from the states. Now, what has really happened is that they have made some additional allocation of 35,000 crores for vaccine distribution. And then, sort of and the Finance Commission has made a recommendation that under the urban or under the local body grants, a certain amount of money should be earmarked for health purposes to strengthen the primary health centers and sub-centers in rural and urban areas. So, and then what they have also done is, this is the way they have, way they try to confuse. They have also added water supply and sanitation along with the health expenditure, and then compared it with the earlier only health expenditure. So, you see a situation, but if you really carefully see, the expenditure increases from 33,896 crores in the current year to somewhere about 67,468 crores. It's not a very, very large increase. And possibly, of the, something like 2,40,000 crores, that is the total spending on health expenditure. This is not very large. And much of the health expenditure will have to come from the state budget, and we will have to see how they do. Because Constitution says the healthcare is a state subject. It is not the central subject. However, central government gives some grants to the states under what is called the centrally sponsored scheme for what is a program called National Health Mission. And National Health Mission and spending plus the additional expenditure that was additional grants that was expected, that was recommended by the 15th Finance Commission. And on defense, actually, one was thinking that there would be a lot more of expenditure, but actually there is it has not increased. And in fact, it is in absolute terms, if you take out the defense pensions, only the defense expenditure is slightly lower than last year and lower than the current year. Current year it is planned at 4.05 lakh crore. Next year it is just about 4.01 lakh crore. It's almost the same. But then, possibly during the course of the year, if the need arises, the government. One of the things that they have done is, again, based on the recommendation of the 15th Finance Commission, they have also created a non-lapsable fund for for defense, because whenever there is a need arises for capital expenditure, suddenly they can't go back to the budget. So you create a fund and keep it in public accounts. See, in the budget there are three compartments. One is consolidated fund, which is basically the basically the thing from where you get the revenues and expenditures and income expenditure. The second is a public account, which is like, keeping, like, basically the government doing some sort of banking type of transaction, whether it is with various funds, whether it is a national small saving fund, which is comprising of the people's contributions for the post office savings and other things, or various cesses and surcharges which are given, which are put in the fund and drawn for spending on specific purposes. And of course, this is a public account, and then there is a contingency fund, which where you in a contingency you take it out and recoup. But in any case, they have created this fund for the defense, non-lapsable fund, and what they intend to do is to monetize the land, held by the Defense Department and various other things, and put the money in the fund. But anyway, I mean, that was a contentious term of reference given to the Finance Commission, and in fact, many people, including me, have said that you may create a fund, but don't reduce the share of the states. So expansion is not very large. Fiscal deficit is 6.8%, and the government will have to watch. And increase in the capital expenditures will help. And then, of course, on terms of the federal dimension, the additional cess for agriculture infrastructure is, in fact, the money that is transferred to the states is called the divisible pool. Divisible pool comprises of all the central taxes, except the central taxes coming from various cesses and surcharges. Once the Finance Commission gives the recommendation, the union government is in the habit of only increasing the cesses and surcharges so that they don't have to share that particular money. This is the way to So this year, in fact, if you see, state share has been steadily in the gross tax revenue of the center has been steadily declining, in spite of the Finance Commission's recommendations have continued to be the same. So these are broadly what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that the economy is likely to recover better. Aggregate demand is not likely to go much higher in the next year, because the aggregate expenditure is not going to go up. But at the same time, since the capital expenditure is going to be higher, possibly there will be better multipliers, and then economy can recover much faster. And of course, the deficit is continuing to be high, and the government needs to watch. But since the private sector borrowing is not really, commercial borrowing is not really taking off, and this is, there may not be serious danger of inflation at this particular moment, but then government needs to watch. Now let me come to the whole issue of reforms. There is one of the major things that they said is that there will be strategic disinvestment and privatization. And obviously, this is something which is, somehow or the other, over the years, we have forgotten what the role of the government should be. The government should come in where the markets fail. And the market failure can be in terms of provision of basic public services. It can, or in terms of, ensuring that markets behave well and through regulation. So the nature of intervention should depend upon the nature of market failure. If the markets don't exist, obviously government should come in and then create those markets. If there is no sufficient information available and what we call the asymmetric information problem, the government should come and help in disseminating the information. But what has happened is that the government has actually taken over, this is a legacy of the past, many of the things, and then of course, when the technology changes, obviously the markets, government intervention also will have to change. For example, there was a time when the technology did not permit the private sector to come into the telecom market. Now you have the private sector in the telecom market, you have the private sector in the airlines, and you have private sector in many other areas. Now, in these cases, the focus of the government should be to ensure that there is a fair competition in the market rather than running airlines. So, in that sense of the term, the decision to privatize Air India, Container Corporation, Container Corporation of India, Shipping Corporation, Bharat Petroleum Limited, Bharat Earth Movers Limited, IDBI Bank, and they're also talking about 2 commercial banks. Now, we'll have to see how this entire thing will proceed. And then, of course, they are changing the problem, this thing, policy and strategic disinvestment. Disinvestment means the government will continue to hold the majority share, but then it will also, sort of dilute, even while holding the majority share, it will dilute the share. Now, that's one of the important. The second thing is the introduction of the creation of what is called the asset restructuring company. The bad loans of the banks have accumulated, as I said, gross non-performing assets. And the banks are unable to lend when you have such a large volume, large percentage of your assets in the bad books. And therefore, this is asset restructuring company is created wherein the banks will sell their bad assets to this asset restructuring company. And asset restructuring company, after buying those bad loans, will start, recovering the money from the borrowers. Now, obviously, the banks will have to lose money in the process of selling because, when now the question is whether the banks will be willing to sell, and sort of at what they will all have to take a haircut in selling, because 100 rupee borrowing may be sold for 20 rupees. Now, how much? And there is always the fear of the Controller General of Account and Controller and Auditor General, the 3 C's. They will always come in and then sort of come in. So, to what extent the public sector banks will be willing to do that, we will have to see. But hopefully, they will be given sufficient incentive to do that. But then so there is so that, once you clean up the balance sheet of the banks, the hope is that the public sector banks will start lending to the commercial works. Now, but then there is a basic reason why the banks have accumulated bad assets. Their capacity to evaluate, the commercially evaluate the things, the political interference in these matters. What will be done in order to improve the governance and the capacity of the public sector banks will have to be seen. The second important and the third important reform that has been put forth is the creation of another institution called the Development Financing Institution. Now, what is happening now is that the banks get their deposits either by way of saving deposits or term deposits for a period of 3 years, 1 year, 5 years. But for infrastructure financing, those companies will have to borrow for 10 years, 15 years. There is a serious asset liability mismatch. And therefore, in the earlier years, they had started, through refinancing of some part of RBI profits, they had started IDBI, ICICI, IFCI, and companies like that, which are basically supposed to lend for long-term purposes for the infrastructure. Then gradually things didn't work out, and then they were given bank licenses and they became banks. Then they created 2 institutions. One is Infrastructure Development Finance Corporation, IDFC, and the ILFS. Now, both, in fact, that again, they didn't lend, things didn't work out. So IDBI was given a bank license. ILFS was a non-banking company, and then that got into all sorts of problems, governance issues, and that has gone bust. Now, so again, we are bringing up this Development Financing Institution. And then, so that's hopefully government has given some 20,000 crores as seed money, and it hopes that they will have sort of, their ambition is to have something like have a portfolio of 5 lakh crore lending portfolio in 3 years' time, and hope that will work. And the fourth important thing is that general insurance, they are trying to reduce, they are encouraging the FDI. There is some, they have increased the FDI limit from 49% to 74%. And there is a large increase that is planned in the infrastructure, whether it's highways um, or metro, urban infrastructure, railways, highways, and inland waterways and things like that. And so these are the broad contours. Now, I mean, in other words, with all the apprehension that I have, I think this is the best that only anybody could have done. And I think this is one of the good the budgets in that sense of the term. The intentions are good, but we will have to now see that, the implementation. In fact, we are all good at creating things, sort of announcing things, but it's the implementation that matters. And we hope they will be able to implement. And any failure to implement these is not going to, we are not going to realize what is said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. That is indeed very enlightening because we were struggling to understand a lot of figures which were thrown up by the budget, and we now realize it's not that simple. That when we talk about an increase in health expenditure and so on, you don't quite realize that a lot of it has to come from the states. Uh, a number of questions arise. There are questions also being put by our members, but I'd like to start with one basic question. And I would also like to request you to, for the benefit of all of us, some of us may not be familiar with economic terminology. Uh, the difference between what you said was the primary deficit and the overall fiscal deficit. Uh,
Yeah,
that's
let me clarify
yeah,
that. Yeah,
yeah.
the government receives revenues, current revenues by way of taxes and non-tax revenues. And the government also spends on wages and salaries, goods and services, subsidies, transfers, interest payments, and things like that. Current expenditures. So one is called the revenue receipts, and the other one is called the revenue expenditure. The difference between the two is called the revenue deficit. Okay, now the difference between the revenue expenditure that you incur for maintenance and basically running the government system, and the revenue receipts that you get there of taxes and non-taxes and things like that. Then what happens is that the next thing that the government does, it borrows. Since the expenditures have to be incurred, even for, obviously the revenue receipts are not enough to meet the revenue expenditure itself. In addition to that, it has to incur capital expenditures. So revenue expenditure and the capital expenditure is the total expenditure. Now, however, in terms of the revenues, it has the revenue receipts, it is done. It also sells some of its asset, as I said, public sector enterprises shares it sells. And that's called non-debt capital receipt. So you add that back. So revenue receipt plus this proceeds from the sale of enterprises. Now the total expenditure minus this total receipts is the amount of money you are required to borrow. And that is called the fiscal deficit. When you say fiscal deficit, you are basically saying that this is the amount of money we are required to borrow. There will be some minor things like changes in the stock, etc., etc. But then broadly that is what is called. So the total expenditure,
Yes,
minus the total revenue receipt plus non-debt capital receipt is the fiscal deficit.
thank you.
Now, in this fiscal deficit, you will also see that part of this fiscal deficit basically includes the total. It also includes some part of the deficit which has arisen because of the past lending. And because of the past lending, what you have to do is the interest payments. So this fiscal part of the fiscal deficit is the interest payments. Now, if you say that, if you remove that, what is the own deficit of this year, taking away this legacy part, that means then fiscal deficit minus the interest payments, and that is the primary deficit. That means that this is the deficit I have incurred for myself for this year, forgetting about what the past. So this is So the debt dynamics equation says that if your primary deficit is zero, that means if you don't do any deficit yourself this year, forget from the past. I mean, the only deficit that you have is the interest payment from the past. If the primary deficit is zero, then so long as your growth rate of the economy is faster than the effective interest rate that you pay, then your debt will not increase, because these are all divided by the GDP. So if the primary deficit to GDP ratio is zero, if your interest payments, that means effective interest rate, and then growth rate of the economy, GDP growth rate, then debt to GDP ratio will not increase. That's basically the idea. So primary deficit. So this I
Yeah.
hope is clarified.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Just one more question from my side. The disinvestment target of 175,000 crores, uh, which seems to be ambitious if one looks at the record of the last year, which was just about one third of what was targeted. Uh, if that does not come through, as some people fear, and there's a further shortage of receipts. And on the other hand, government's attempts to trim expenditure uh, by way of subsidies. Now there is a cut of an expected cut in fertilizer subsidy of about 40%, food subsidy, petroleum subsidy. These things, if they're not politically feasible, as they may well be, in which case the overall expenditure would not come down very much. Receipts will fall short of expectations, and in that case, the budget deficit may be more than what has been estimated. Will that not generate inflationary pressures that have not been anticipated?
Let me put the matter this way. Now, the government will have to come and with an amended Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. Now, that Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act will have to give the glide path for reduce the fiscal deficit from next year onwards. Now, this year they have said that budget deficit is somewhere about 6.4% of 6.8% of GDP. In the budget speech, Finance Minister has also said that by 2025-26, she will reduce the fiscal deficit to 4% of GDP. Now, no, she will reduce the fiscal deficit to 4.5% of GDP. And actually, the Finance Commission has given the glide path. Because it was asked to make a recommendation on the fiscal consolidation path. And it said that by 25-26, the union government will have to reduce the fiscal deficit by 4%, which basically implies that she has not accepted their recommendation. No, because she has already pegged it at higher level. But whatever be the case, she has to work out the consolidation path from 2022-23 onwards. For this, and then obviously she will also have to lay down what she is going to do. In fact, from 2020, 21, 22 onwards, she has to lay down what the fiscal deficit numbers would be. And then this has to, and then she'll have to come to the parliament and tell to the parliament if there is a change. She has to tell them, give an explanation to the parliament why there has been a change. This is the formal issue. On the specific issue that you mentioned, they're hoping that they will be able to, since last year they were not able to do this disinvestment. There is a large part of the disinvestment they had hoped to get from LIC, by selling the shares of LIC. Large part, substantial part of it from Bharat Petroleum Limited. So they're supposed to, and then they're hoping that they will be able to get it. You are correct in saying that in the past so many years, not just last year, so many years, the disinvestment targets have not been achieved. But there is a hope that, for example, they they might come out with the action plan, since they could not do it possibly everything is accumulated and they might come up with the action plan in the first part of the year itself. That's what they say. And, we will have to wait and see. But you are right that there can be shortfall. And there may be, there may also be a political pressure to increase the subsidies, as you mentioned. There are two possibilities open. One is the 26% increase in the capital expenditures that is shown will be compressed. What happens in our system is capital expenditures is always a residual. You always, you get a, when the budget is presented, you get a feel good factor. Oh, there is so much of capital expenditure. But during the course of the year, if the things don't work out, you basically reduce capital expenditure and then, work and then continue to spend. The other possibility is that the fiscal deficit may go up. So there are both the possibilities are open. Now, consequence of that, as I said, will depend upon if the economy picks up. You see, what happens is that this 6.8% that I talk about fiscal deficit is the amount of money that the government is required to borrow. In addition to that, the government at the state government level, they will have to borrow. They will be borrowing about 4% of GDP. So in the process, what happens? Somewhere about 11% of the money that is available in the financial system will be borrowed. How do they do it? There is this statutory liquidity ratio, which is requiring the banks to keep 18% of their demand and time liabilities in government securities. And this is the way they go about. Now, where does the money come from? Money comes from you and me. The household sector's financial savings. You see, there is a corporate sector, there is a government sector, there is a household sector. Corporate sector would need more money to borrow for their own investments. The government obviously is not a surplus sector, it is a deficit sector, as we say, 6.9% plus another 4%. And it is only the household sector which has a surplus because it doesn't invest as much as it saves. So the total household sector, and also part of the saving is in physical assets like land and gold and things. Household sector financial saving was 7.6%, but last year it might have increased because of the precautionary motive, and because there was no opportunity for you to spend because people could not go on holidays, and we could not spend on things because there was lockdown. So in other words, this year there may not be much of a problem because corporate sector was also not borrowing, and the government and the household sector had a surplus, much more savings. But next year, in fact, before that, household sector financial saving was just about 7.6%. So if you take 7.6%, and if you go on, if you go something like 10 to 11% for government, then obviously there is a pressure. And that pressure could translate itself into higher prices. This is the way it happens. But what is likely to happen is that, there may not be pickup very fast this year. Private sector may not be really demanding. Now, what the government has been doing is that whenever there is a pressure, it does a backdoor sort of a thing. It actually is done by the Reserve Bank. What happens when the government borrows more and when the corporates also more? Interest rates have to go up because it's the same level of saving. In order to prevent the interest, the government has to borrow at low rate of interest because they want to, what that's called the financial repression. They want to contain they want to force, lower rate of interest. So what the Reserve Bank of India does is that, it keeps, what it does is you have the government securities, it has a host of government securities. It simply sells off these securities, and this is called the open market operation. And when you sell off these securities, and what happens is, what happens is that at that time, government actually purchases these securities from the banks because the bank is the one which has the government security. When it purchases the securities, it actually issues new currency. So in other words, indirect monetization of the deficit is taking place. In fact, this year, The amount of monetization works out to somewhere about 3.5 lakh crore. And if you really go on increasing the monetization, of the deficit, indirect, saying that, oh, liquidity is the problem. Earlier we used to directly monetize. Now, after 1996, they stopped it. Now, indirectly we do this. So the money supply is much more and the economy doesn't pick up, then there will be inflationary pressure. I'm sorry for a long answer, but then there were...
No, so it's ultimately means printing of fresh currency
Absolutely.
and
That
putting
is
it
the
into
way.
the system.
That is that's the way. And inflation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Now, may I throw it open to the members? Whoever would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself. It's open to you. The floor is all yours. And I mean, any question. We are not economists. We are all laymen. So, but here is an opportunity.
Hello.
Hi,
Yeah,
good evening.
please come in.
Hello.
Yes,
Yes,
come in.
yes, yes. Yeah, you are.
About the railway budget, how it has been incorporated into the main budget this year.
Is that Balasubramaniam Sattanam
Yes, sir.
or Jaiswal?
Railway finances, how it has been balanced with the main budget.
See, actually, this sort of assimilation of the railway budget in the main budget has happened something like 3, 4 years ago. And what they have done is basically whatever is the whatever is the revenue, they take it in the receipt separately. Expenditure, they take it, they net it out, revenue and expenditure, and separately provide for the capital expenditure. And then, of course, give a very detailed analysis in the demand for grants for the railways. So that is how they have incorporated that. I'll just take 5 seconds. There is somebody there. I just 1 minute, half a minute. Yeah. Sorry, that was. Yeah. So basically, they have assimilated this in railway budget into the main budget itself, and the details will be available with the railway ministry, because it's that sort of obviously the revenues are not taken. The revenues and expenditures are netted out and then taken into the system.
Yeah.
Why I asked was, during this period of Corona, railways were the most affected, and the common man had to use other transports. So when the lockout has been lifted, how do they make up the system of public transport? That is why my question was prompted.
No, in fact, you see, during Corona, both railways and roadways, but the roadways is basically the state's responsibility. It doesn't really, come into the main budget. So basically, what they have done is this will be shown as a deficit, which is separately kept out, and then obviously, sort of, it's met through the borrowing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sandeep Jaiswal has a question. Hold on. There is someone else in the queue. Yeah, Sandeep Jaiswal. He wanted to ask a question. Please. Yeah.
Hello.
Come in. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for your talk. At the end of your talk, you said this is the best they could have done, and the intention is good, and the implementation is the key. So, what kind of challenges might come during implementation? Thank you.
There can be many issues of implementation. One is the political economy factors. As was already said, that whether we will be able to really reduce the deficit, reduce the subsidies and transfers, and during the course of the year, what are the additional demands that will come through, whether we will be able to really do the disinvestment and privatization as we have planned, because that's a key, because 1.75 175,000 crores is not a small amount of money. So whether we will be able to do that, how effectively, all these reforms can be really carried out. Basically, the assets restructuring company, what sort of a reform are you going to put through into the commercial, into public sector banks in order to improve their governance in the system? How are you going to how is the government going to distance itself from the management of various banks? Because you have all sorts of problems with government ownership, because there is phone banking. Now you don't have phone banking, but there is a there is a allocation saying that MSME should be given this much, 50,000 crore credit. The agriculture should be given 16,000 crore credit. I mean, for commercial decisions, you don't decide. It has to be the commercial. It has to be the commercial decisions. In other words, government interference and lending decisions will have to go. How exactly are you going to do it? And again, creation of the investment company, for long-term lending, and how we are, how this is going to happen. They have also talked about the creation of something like some reforms in the higher education, and actually abolishing the University Grants Commission and bringing about the National Higher Education Commission. Now, what is likely to happen, whether they can carry this out or not, these are some of the questions that we have. So implementation is, they actually announced the agricultural reform policies without going through the rigmarole of detailed discussions. Now they are facing the problem. The political economy is not that easy in this country. They have realized it. Now they are facing the problem which cannot be implemented. So we will have to see how exactly they will go about doing this.
At this stage, I would request Dr. Krishna to come in and say hello to Dr. Rao. Dr. Krishna.
Yeah.
Hello, Professor Krishna. How are you?
Oh, fine, very fine.
You're meeting after a long time.
I'm really grateful to you for accepting the invitation and coming and giving an excellent presentation. I think it is being appreciated by everyone. You are very insightful and informative. I think you have come to the level of the layman as you wanted, but covered all the aspects in considerable detail. In fact, this is my first week in Atashri. When Dr. Raja asked me about this Saturday meeting, I immediately thought of you and approached you. I am grateful to you for accepting the invitation and taking the trouble of preparing a very good presentation. Of course, for you, this is very child's play, but for us, all of us, it is a delightful experience. Thank you very much. And
Professor Krishna, you have been a teacher. We have learned so much from you, and we always look forward to your guidance. And obviously, anything that we speak, any good thing if we speak, that owes to you, and any bad things if we speak, we are not responsible. And I was telling just before you.
I thank Dr. Raja also to making this possible. And I think the very first day of my stay in Atashri, you mentioned this, and immediately I thought of you, and it's a very pleasant experience. I think we all appreciate your work. And yeah, thank you.
No, I was telling that the lecture that I delivered in MIDS, when that foundation lecture on public finance, so when you were the chairman, that has eventually I've developed into a book which should be coming out in the next 3 months. It's called Reflections on Indian Public Finance. Oxford is publishing that. Oxford University Press is publishing that. So I think that from that, the lecture that I delivered at MIDS, eventually I brought expanded it into a book. That's what I was telling him.
I'm so happy to see this interaction between two old friends. And in fact, this is the first time that Dr. Krishna is attending our conversations. I hope you will now be able to get us many more speakers like Dr. Rao and be able to help us. I was reading about Dr. Krishna the other day and what many of his students had to say about him. You know, every one of them. And I read names like Onkar Goswami, persons like Ramachandra Guha, Kaushik Basu, writing about him, and all of them every one of them talk about his humility. And some of them had also mentioned about coming into the class and lecturing for years without any notes in hand. And I mean, when one read all that, one was really inspired. And I'm so happy that such a person as he is one of us in Athasri. So formally welcome to Athasri. Although you've come.
Now, in this connection, I want to say something. There was a book that was edited in his honor. And on the edited, it was edited, and there is an event of releasing the book. And obviously, very eminent people went on saying that, oh, Professor Krishna was my teacher, Professor Krishna was my teacher, and everybody, sort of talking about the glorious days and the level of sort of understanding they received from him. And then came the turn of Monte Ahluwalia. Monte Ahluwalia said that, no, Professor Krishna, I can't say he was my teacher, but he was my teacher in law. Because he was, Ishar was the one who had taken the lead Ishar Ahluwalia was the one who taken the lead in sort of, getting this book in his honor. Yes. So I remember that when you mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we take in a couple of more questions?
Sure. Yeah.
I'm there. Okay. I believe someone wanted to ask a question. Wanted to come in. Please come in. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't see your face.
Yeah. Can you now?
Yeah. Come in.
Now we can. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening and thanks for an excellent lecture. My question is very naive. Will we ever have a surplus budget?
Well, I don't think we will ever have a surplus budget. In a lighter vein, it's, finance ministers are not like housewives. In fact, housewives are the best finance ministers. They know what prudence is, and then actually manage the household expenses in a prudent manner. But then finance ministers don't have that incentive to do so. So we will never have a surplus budget. But then, given the fact that expenditure requirements are so much, and so you do need to really borrow. But what is important is that you borrow in such a manner that you borrow to create certain assets. Just as you have to, as a householder, you have to borrow to have a house, or borrow to have a car or something like that. No, with the hope that you will have the rate of return on the money that you use enough to pay back the loan. So basically, when he's saying that the debt should not increase, we should really contain and reduce the debt over a period of time. It's basically meaning that you should borrow for creating those assets which will generate a rate of return.
Thank you. And to create a better economy, isn't it better to create jobs than giving freebies by the government?
Absolutely. But then there are two things that have to be done. It's always better to create infrastructure facilities, economic activities, so that jobs can be created.
Yeah.
That is one of the important things. However, there are some people who are absolutely poor. They don't have the second meal tomorrow. Now, in that case, you don't, as a civilized society, we don't allow them to die.
Yeah.
And therefore, some immediate relief will have to be done. You see, markets don't do redistribution. The redistribution has to be done by the government. So nobody will, so obviously government will have to come. So when people are in a very bad situation, and you may have to really bring about some amount of social security for those people, old, and then of course destitute and extremely poor people and all that. But it's always better to empower the people. In fact, instead of making redistribution, it's better to give them education, healthcare,
Yeah.
skill, and then so that they can get better jobs.
As they say, it's better to teach fishing than giving.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And another thing I noticed is the gap between the rich people and the poor people are widening.
Yeah, no, I
Why is
mean,
it so?
no, the gap between the rich and the poor will continue to rise. That's not because the rich man has more capital and he will make more capital out of the capital.
Mm.
But the question is, we need to really look at whether by reducing the incomes of the rich, can we increase the incomes of the poor?
No, increase the
We,
income of the poor
we
and
don't need, we need those people who can create jobs.
yeah.
We need to have them incentive to create jobs, and so that the poor people can take those jobs and do things. And obviously the government has to take more money from those rich people so that it can also do it. But then there is a tendency in people is to think that the government is a benevolent it's a benevolent which is always looking for the welfare. But if you really look at it very carefully, do all the governments, its actions, do they really increase the welfare of the people, or does it increase the welfare of the bureaucracy or the politician?
Well, we come
Thank
to the
you.
last question of the evening. Kiran Nanda. Kiran Nanda.
पापा
Yeah, come in.
काम नहीं है
Hello. Yeah, go ahead.
मिस्टर राजा
Yes.
करे I have
Please hold on. There's one other person in the queue, Kiran Nanda.
thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Do you have any question? Okay. Mrs. Lavkare, come in.
Yeah. Well, it was very well presented, Mr. Rao. However, a lay person like me who doesn't have an economic background, I may be asking questions which may not come to your expectation.
One
but I
question.
just-
One question.
Only one question.
Yeah, the last question.
Oh my God. Now I just, I'm baffled. I don't know which question I should ask you.
You decide.
But has the budget made provisions for raising resources to meet the increasing expenditure of different sectors? And has it made any provision for improving the job employment opportunities for women?
For women, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any
Now-
special programs for women?
Yeah.
Job.
Now,
opportunity.
see, on the issue of raising resources, there are no new taxes. But then they are taking into account a little more of non-tax revenue from various dividends and then sort of things like that. But my most important thing is, they're taking something like 1.75 lakh crores by way of selling off public sector enterprises. What they call the disinvestment, the asset monetization. There are also a lot of discussion on sort of how they have to do asset monetization in the various companies, but not in the budget proper. See, for example, National Highway Authority of India selling certain segments of the roads to the private sector for collecting the tolls and and similar other operations. So other than that, there are no new taxes. Of course, there is 1% cess on the existing taxes, and that is for creating agricultural infrastructure. On the second question, on creating sort of improving the job or employment opportunities, I don't think there is any special program for women.
Okay. Father Matthew, would you like to say a few words? Father Matthew?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Govind for your stunning and fabulous analysis of the present budget. One thing you are saying that this is one of the best budgets in the last several years. And another one, as a takeaway, I see that you were explaining when the market forces are failing, the government has to come in. As we know very well that the government, the market forces are based on their profit making, and sometimes it can go to the extent of a greed. So therefore, in which way the government can come in so that they can support the ordinary person, the citizens who might be affected by the market forces and their livelihood are to a certain extent curtailed. So could you just give us a little
Yeah,
more?
no, in fact, you see, there is a basic thing like providing a law and order, ensuring property rights, ensuring and sort of enforcing contracts. I mean, these are the basic thing that the government has to do anyway, because without that, the society doesn't work. Or there is no incentive for savings, investment, and or growth if you don't ensure property rights, if you don't ensure safety and security of the people, etc., etc. That is what we in economics call the basic public good. Then there are some things where there are a lot of externalities, highways, roadways, where the private benefits, social benefits are much higher than the private benefits. So the government can come and then either, so make sure that this adequate things are provided by through various inducements, or it has to possibly, produce it itself. That's second. But then the point that you are saying that the private sector has agreed. Indeed, private sector has agreed. No, just as the public sector is not always altruistic, because there is always a politician and a bureaucrat who is trying to maximize his own gains there. But nevertheless, private sector does have a read, because the private sector exists to make profits. Now the question is whether this profit is made in a legitimate manner or by sort of creating problems for others. These are the things that has to be seen. That is the reason why you need to really have a strong regulation. That is the reason why you need a competition commission. That is the reason why you need to really have a somebody who is basically looking at banks and then regulating them to see that depositors' money is safe. So now what has happened is that you thought that, oh, the private sector is making a lot of profit in five-star hotels, so let us start the five-star hotels. So the government doesn't have the capacity to start a five-star hotel and run, because the incentive doesn't exist, because the fellow running a five-star hotel is not bothered about, because in any case the money is a common money. So you need to really see. That is the reason why to see where the market fails, what is the nature of the market failure. Say, for example, the private sector doesn't do redistribution. It doesn't care for the poor. Now, in fact, there is a beautiful article by Mansell Olson, one of the great public choice theorists, where he talks about the 19th century Chinese warlord in China, where China was infested with roving bandits. China was infested with roving bandits. And in that situation, there was no incentive to save, incentive to invest, incentive to grow. At that time, one of the strong bandits told the people that, look, I will protect you from other bandits, but you should give me a constant share of your income. And people gave that money to him. It's a protection money. And so obviously incentives developed to save in. So from roving banditry, you moved into a stationary bandit. But the stationary bandit had no incentive to look after the poor. And that is the reason why you get into a democracy, where in that, basically poor also have to be looked after. They are also human beings. So the point that I'm trying to make is the government should see where it has to do, and it has to do it well. If the government says that I will run BSNL, MTNL, Now, I mean, the technology is not, sort of has advanced so much that, and then you see, nobody bothers about the BSNL and MTNL. And then what happens? Government, it says that I will give 30,000 crores of taxpayers' money to look after the BSNL, MTNL. And all. That is not the way. So you need to see where the market fails and control the private sector to prevent it from predatory competition, and so that the competition is fair. They don't do abnormal profits, they don't do monopoly profits, and then that is the reason why you need to come and control. That is the reason why you have Competition Commission, you have Reserve Bank of India, you have many other institutions.
Thank you so much. Splendid explanation, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm sure a lot of others have plenty of questions in hand, but time would not permit us to take them on. May I request Reverend Sukumar to propose a vote of thanks. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Rao.
Sir, it's been a pleasure. It's a pleasure talking to you all, because one of the person said that her question may not be, she's a lay person. I think these are the most important questions. And I really appreciate the questions that have been, sort of put.
We'd like to have you again sometime later.
Sure.
When you're free.
Anytime.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, Sir Reverend Sukumar.
Sir, Dr. M. Govind Rao, on behalf of Ecumenical Christian Center and Athosri, with immense gratitude, with profound respect, we're extremely delighted to know you and your massive wealth of knowledge. In fact, we are fortunate to have you with us. After looking your biodata, we were curious to know more about you and your analysis on the topic, the union budget and analysis for the layman. Though you have global reputation, after your presentation, I come to know that you are down to earth. Your presentation was simple, yet it was brilliant analysis. Your presentation also thought-provoking. In fact, it was electrifying session. Thank you for exploring multiple layers of economic dimensions during COVID-19. Human tragedy, especially in the light of migrant laborers, issues related with the commercial tax, issues related with the role of corporates, revenue collections, growth of GDP. Thank you very much indeed for unpacking how budget was irrelevant, also more relevant, with the comparative analysis with 2018 and 19. Challenges to revive economy, role of public administration, importance of National Policy Fund, role of Finance Commission. Yes, as you say, there is a need to raise tax revenues, especially as government is providing vaccine distribution. Thanks a lot for explaining three major categories of the budget: consolidated, public account, and contingency. It is amazing to know four profound dynamic reforms of the union budget. Certainly, this budget
He's my teacher, so
reforms with the good intentions indeed, so that common people can be benefited. Thank you very much indeed, sir. We also extend our profound gratitude to Professor KCR Raja, also the Director of Ecumenical Christian Center, Professor Father Matthew Chandran Kunel, also Deputy Director Tanminlun Wepe, for organizing an amazing and brilliant online event. Thank you very much indeed.
That brings this meeting to an end. I might mention here that we've had a number of invitees from outside Bangalore, from Bombay, from Delhi, even one of our friends in New Jersey. And 9 of my friends from the Rotary Club of Bangalore. So it's been a very, very enjoyable evening. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You're being very kind. Thank you very much.
Yes, Menlun. You're calling it a day.